Um, I just want to start by presenting DAPNet for those who don't know who we are. So we're a nonprofit that aims to connect people in the draft animal power network. Haha. Um, and we are trying to connect people with mentors or with trainings or any education opportunity, and basically uh, teach and give opportunity to learn to the most people we can. Sorry, my English is not great because I'm not from the States. I'm actually Quebecois, so you'll forgive me for that. I will have weird sentences sometimes. So my name is Daphne. I'm a horse logger from Quebec, and I am interviewing Rich Dumond. And so you're a part of DAPNet. You've been a part of DAPNet for a long time, and so we're having you tonight at this DAPChat where everybody's invited to participate if you raise your hand, or if you write in the chat, you can ask questions and I'll ask them to Rich, or you can just raise your hand and talk. So everybody's greatly encouraged to do so. This is just an opportunity to connect and be with our community. So that's what it is. So Rich, tell us about you. Who are you?
Well, I live in the mountains of Northeast Pennsylvania. About 10 years ago, I went to Cornell University and attended their farrier program. And through the course of shoeing working horses here in this area, I actually got invited to take my draft horses into the woods with a local longtime horse logger back in probably 2017. And so around 2016, 2017, I started working commercially in the woods with my horses and kind of learned the logging business. That has since sort of morphed into a mixed power operation where I do use some machinery now. I still do have my draft horses as well. And I've had quite a bit of experience both working with machinery and with horses in the woods. And I still also do shoe horses as well. So I split my time about 50% shoeing and 50% logging. In the wintertime, the shoeing business slows down a little bit because horses' feet don't grow as fast, and most equestrians are not doing as many shows and activities with their horses in the winter. So I do get to spend a little more time in the woods this time of year. But my shoeing actually predates my logging, so that is sort of the foundation of my business.
And we can say that it's interesting to talk to you about working draft horses because you do it and you shoe them. So you're the perfect person to ask shoeing or feet horse hooves related questions about working animals.
Well, I appreciate that. I don't know if I'm the perfect person, but I do have experience on both ends of it. Having shod my own horses now for the better part of 10 years or a little longer. I actually trimmed my own horses prior to that because it's hard to find people to do draft horses. I do have a fair bit of experience at least, and some experience with what works and what doesn't work. So I would be flattered to be a resource for anybody who would like to consult with me about how to manage their own or others working animals.
And just wondering, do you have a lot of clients that have working horses, or are your horses the only horses that you shoe for work?
Mine are the primary ones. I don't have that many clients that actually use their horses for work. The majority of the workhorses in this part of Pennsylvania belong to Amish farms and Amish farmers and loggers. Most of them tend to do their own horses. So I have provided consultations and advice for a lot of Amish who have horses that they really would prefer to keep, but have had either soundness issues or longevity issues. And so I have done quite a bit of consultation, but as far as the number of working horses in this area that I get to trim or shoe, the numbers are actually pretty low. Most people in this area that have horses keep them more or less as pets or backyard pleasure horses. With a few, I do have quite a few clients that compete with light horses in things like dressage and rodeo type events. But as far as working animals, there are not that many in this area aside from the Amish.
Right. And do you get to, well, you said you did help them um or consulted, but do you have like references like person or farrier in the Amish community that you can refer to if you have questions or other concerns?
Um, I missed just a part of that. Sorry, one of my dogs was really complaining about needing to go out. But you were asking if there are many in the Amish community that what?
That you can like refer to? Are there like
Oh,
specialists that you can refer to, or is
yes,
or
there actually are some pretty good Amish farriers in my area that shoe a lot of working horses, and I've actually had some clients that I have worked for intermittently that typically would trailer their horses to Amish farriers. And there have been times that I've consulted with them. Most Amish are sort of, I mean, I think the same is true for most human beings in general, but a lot of them are fairly set in their ways and have a way of doing things that they don't look for answers outside of. But there are some that I have worked pretty closely with. Yeah.
right? So let's dive into the subject now that we know a little bit more about you. Um, so we had divided this presentation in like 4 or 5 topics. If anyone wants to ask questions or anything, we can divert from that. It's not a problem. But the first topic was, what is it to to work a horse's feet? And that was a pun, but you know, like what is the anatomy of the feet, and like how do you work around the feet, and like how do we like the balance, the points, what are your points of focus? And I put some images just to refer if you want to.
Sure. That's great. Yeah, so if you look at the image of the bottom, the ground surface of the foot on the right, um, there, for those of you that work on your own horse's feet, there are a few general markers that are good to get in the habit of looking for. First of all, you want what we call the buttress of the heels, or where the hoof wall ends. If you look at that picture of the ground surface of the foot on the right, where the enamel ends right below the heel bulbs. On a trimmed foot, you want the point of that hoof wall or that enamel to more or less be in the center of the heel bulbs. Now I will preface this by saying there are standards and there are targets that we look for. All horses to some degree are going to deviate from the standard or the target. So you're not always going to be able to get your horse's foot to look like a perfect example of what a healthy foot should look like. But as far as supporting the weight of the animal and doing what the foot is supposed to do, you'd like the buttress of the heels, or the point of the heel enamel, to be more or less in the center of the hoof wall. As far as toe length goes, when you look at the apex of the frog, which is marked on that diagram, and also if you look at the left-hand side where it shows the bony column, that doesn't show the extensor and flexor tendons. But if you look at the top of the coffin bone, sort of where the peak of the coffin bone is, where it meets the short pastern. Yes, exactly where the cursor is, right there. If you could hang a plumb bob from that spot straight down, that will drop down just about 3/8 or a half an inch behind the apex of the trimmed frog. So when you look at that point of the foot, you should have less than half or about 35 to 40% of the foot from that point to the toe. And then you should have between 60 and 65% from that point, just behind the apex of the frog, to the buttress of the heels. So the reason for that is you want more than half of the foot supporting the weight of the animal, and you want less than half of the foot to be necessary for breakover. So when a horse takes a step, that point that I was saying, if you could hang a plumb bob from the top of the coffin bone to straight down through the foot, that is basically the fulcrum or the pivot point of the foot. So the more material you have in front of that point, the harder it is for the horse to break over or to take a step. Kind of like if you had a pair of shoes on that was 5 sizes too big and you went for a jog, it would cause all kinds of discomfort and pain in your leg by the time you were done with that jog. So you want, from just behind the apex of the frog to the toe, you want about 35 or 40% of the overall size of the foot. And from that point back, you want 60 to 65%. So as you're looking at the bottom of the foot, when you trim it, you want to kind of keep that in mind. Now, there are tools, there are calipers, or some farriers use a ruler to measure that, to kind of quantify it. But if you can trim the heels so that they are more or less in the center of the heel bulbs, and you can trim the toe back without taking too much sole out, until it is less than half of the overall surface, the ground surface of the foot, then you're going to be really close to being in proper balance as far as anterior and posterior balance, front to back on the foot. Aside from that, as far as balancing the foot, if you can look straight down on the ground surface of the foot as you're holding your horse's foot up, you want to make sure that that plane is relatively flat. And that diagram on the right-hand side of the slide there, the left, it points out the portion of the foot that is referred to as the quarter. That part of the foot does not need to be in contact with the ground, especially with heavy horses. A lot of times that's the part of the foot that flares. And sometimes the hoof wall, yes, exactly where the cursor is there. That part of the foot often does flare and become kind of weak. And that will generally be the first part of the foot to chip away or to sort of trim itself at the end of a trimming cycle. And that's okay if that part of the foot does not contact the ground. That's perfectly okay. But you do want the buttress of the heels to be nice and flat and broad, more or less trimmed to the widest point of the frog. And then you want from the apex of the frog, or just behind the apex of the frog, to the toe to be clearly less than half, especially on a big heavy horse. And if you can do those things, that will get your horse really close to being balanced as far as providing the support that they need and reducing breakover to a point where they can work comfortably for long periods of time without becoming sore.
I have a question for you, Rich.
Sure.
So, I'll talk about my horse so that everybody can relate or not. But so my horse is imbalance and has more growth on the inside of, or growth, or wears more on the outside. So how would you manage this? Would you correct it? Would you?
Okay, that's a very good question. So almost every horse is going to be, almost every horse will wear unevenly when you're looking at the medial lateral balance or the inside outside balance of the foot. And that's because, like I said, we have these standards and we have kind of these ideals, but most horses are not perfectly conformed to the standards. So if your horse is a little bit toed in, if the center of their hoof, if you could draw a line down the center of their hoof at the toe, so that exactly 50% of their hoof wall is to the outside and exactly 50% is to the inside. Most horses are either going to be toed out or toed in a little bit. And even if a horse is perfectly square straight ahead, that's not a guarantee that their foot is going to wear perfectly balanced either. So when we trim the foot, you want, excuse me, you want the hoof wall to mirror the white line, and you want the white line to mirror the coronet or the hairline. As the foot grows and as it wears, it's going to deviate from that. If you get a little bit of flare in the hoof wall, then the hoof wall is going to tend to stretch, and the perimeter of the hoof wall is going to deviate from the perimeter of the white line. So as you trim that foot, you want to focus on bringing the perimeter of the hoof wall back into a uniform shape as it pertains to the white line. And then when you set the foot down and you look at it from the top, you want the perimeter of the hoof wall to mirror the shape of the hairline. And that's a good place to start. There are some other issues, especially if you're working barefoot horses, that can arise from horses that are sort of far outside of the ideal conformation. But that's a pretty good place to start. What Daphne brought up about the hoof distorting as it grows and a horse wearing more on one side than the other, that is extremely typical. So when you trim that horse's foot, you really do want to try to bring it back as much to the standard as possible without removing too much material or thinning out, especially the ground surface of the foot, as much as possible. And if you wanted to flip to the next slide, the bottom of that foot. So there you can see that this would be the left front, I believe. You can see what is on the right side of that foot is a little, over where she's got the cursor on the right side of that foot, that would be the lateral side of the foot. I'm guessing by the way that it is a little more full in the quarter and a little more broad there. Based on the shape of that foot, I would bet that that horse would wear, if I'm not mistaken, the way Daphne was saying that her horse wears, where might get a little bit of flare to the inside and wear a little bit harder on the outside. That's actually the way my main horse, Hershey, my mare, her foot is very much like this foot. I borrowed this from another farrier. This is not one of my clients' horses'
So
feet.
Rich,
But yeah, go ahead.
This would be the inside and this would be the outside, or?
Vice versa. The side that's on the right side of the photo there, I would suspect is the outside of the horse's foot. This would be the right front on this horse. So you can see how this farrier, and he's far exceeded what I think I will ever attain. The guy that trimmed this foot is named Craig Turnka, and he's worth following if you do any trimming or any shoeing. He's amazing.
I'll put his name in the chat. What did you say his name?
His first name is Craig, Craig, and his last name is Turnka. It's Trnka. Sort of lacking a couple vowels there, but his last name is Turnka, Trnka. And he is the founder of the World Champion Blacksmith page on Facebook. He's a really outstanding farrier that does a lot of really phenomenal work. One of the things that I've picked up from him recently is rather than looking at a foot, which when I first got out of shoeing school, sort of by nature, the way that I would look at a foot is what can I remove? In practicality, it's kind of subtle. The difference is kind of subtle, but he's a big advocate of what can you leave rather than what can you remove. So you can see on this foot, he has not trimmed any sole out of this horse's foot. And we might be sort of skipping ahead to working barefoot horses, but if you look at this picture on this slide, it's a very modest trim of the frog. He really just opened up the frog so that it is more inclined to shed debris. And beyond that, he really didn't take much material off. And he removed the bars where they would be overlapping the sole. But other than that, it's a very modest trim. He really hasn't touched the sole. And the hoof wall is really just brought back to mirror the white line there. It's a very uniform thickness, like she's showing with the cursor there. It's the hoof wall that on this trim is extremely uniform. And that's ideally, that's what you'd like the bottom of the foot to look like. Now, you know, there can be issues or horses that have, you know, a convex sole instead of concave, where their sole is a little bit proud, and then that gets into that. It gets a little bit tricky, but in a relatively normal foot, this is really what you would like your trim to look like. You'd like the buttress of the heels to be back to the widest point of the frog, more or less to the center of the heel bulbs as much as possible. And you can see, even just at a glance, from the apex of the frog to the buttress of the heels is more than 50% of the ground surface of that foot. And that's what you want to see. That's the primary weight bearing portion of the foot, from the apex of the frog to the buttress of the heels. And so you want that to be more than 50%, especially on heavy horses, because they have so much weight to support. So, and then from the apex of the frog to the toe is no more than it needs to be. It's less than 50%, somewhere in the 40% range. And that really gives them the mechanical advantage when they go to take a step, that they're not straining their tendons and their ligaments too much. So, so anyway, that's kind of that's a good visual of what I was trying to explain on that first slide, of what you look for on the ground surface of the foot if you're trimming your own horses.
And Rich, here's a question. I know there's different ways to trim the bars, or I've heard different people talking about different ways to trim bars, but what is your thought on this?
I tend to trim bars a little more aggressively than maybe even Craig Turnka. For horses, especially heavy horses that are being used regularly in a variety of terrain, a long bar can be a real problem area for abscesses. So the reason for that is the hoof wall, the enamel, which is what the bars are made out of, that is the hardest substance on the foot. The hoof wall is the hardest substance on the foot. And then the white line, which follows the perimeter of the foot and also the perimeter of the bars, is softer than that. And the sole is a little bit harder than the white line, but is softer than the enamel. So what happens if the bars, which are made of the hardest material in the foot, are too long, they grow forward and they overlap the sole, and they overlap the white line that follows the enamel there in the bars. And so with that overlap, if they get a grain of sand or a pebble or something like that stuck up underneath the bar, every time they take a step, the tendency is that it's going to, it'd be like if you had a pebble in your socks and you're wearing boots. Your foot is softer than your boot, and so your foot is going to take the abuse of that rock or that pebble every time you take a step. And it's the same way with any debris that would get in between the bar and the sole, or the bar and the white line. That being the case, as a farrier, I tend to trim the bars even a little more aggressively than what you see here, mostly because 9 out of 10 times when a client of mine has a horse that goes lame from an abscess, it is in the bars. And so if I keep those bars short, they're less likely to get abscesses. Now, the argument for leaving the bars a little bit longer is that it is part of the weight-bearing structure of the foot. And so some people like to try to keep the bars sort of somewhat in contact with the ground. That can be a little bit risky for the reasons that I said. So if the bars are overlaying the sole at all, which in this photo, they are actually just a hair overlaying the sole. Depending on the terrain that that horse is on and the thickness of the sole and all this stuff, and how often their feet are cleaned out and all these variables, that could open that horse up to the possibility or the probability of abscesses. there in the bars. And for those of us that kind of rely on our horses for a living, if you have a horse that has an abscess, that's like anywhere from 2 to 20 days that your horse might be lame. And so that's kind of discouraging. So that's for those reasons, I do tend to trim the bars relatively aggressively without getting too carried away. So I use my hoof knife, and I would take the bars out until there is a distinct line where you can see the bar, and you can see and we might even see this in a couple of the photos ahead on the slides of my horse's feet that I have shot, where you can see distinctly where the enamel is and the white line and the sole, and there's no overlap there. Abscesses are just a real pain in the butt, and so I try to do everything I can to avoid that.
Right. And so you shoe horses mostly for, well, the horses that your clients have are show horses, or horses that are used for riding mostly, is that what I'm understanding?
For the most part, yes. There are some horses that I shoe that are used for driving, but even the ones that I shoe that are used for driving tend to be lighter horses like Morgans or crosses, standard bred draft crosses that are more of an all-purpose horse.
Yeah, okay. And so is there a big difference in the movement or in the way the feet lands on the ground when the horse is pulling something, or heavy weight or not, rather than just being ridden?
That's a really good question. There actually is, if a horse is if they're pulling a heavy load, like if we're talking about logging horses or plowing horses, most horses, of course, horses are very intelligent and they become accustomed to whatever we ask them to do. So a horse that is just walking with a rider on its back is going to load its foot differently than a horse that is pulling a heavy load. And horses kind of have this automatic traction device built in where they get accustomed to what the footing is like. Horses really don't like slipping, and so they will adapt to contact the ground in a way that minimizes slipping. And in my experience, especially if you're going uphill or you're pulling a heavy load on flat ground, horses tend to load their toe first. Some horses, if you watch horse pulls, there are times that horses will be pulling with all their might and their heels aren't even on the ground. And you don't really see that with pleasure horses or horses that are being ridden. Generally, ideally, a horse that is at ease, you want their heels to contact the ground first and then their toe, or maybe even it's acceptable if they land perfectly flat. But ideally, a horse would land heel first, then toe. But you don't see that so much when a horse is pulling really heavy weight. You'll see them rise up on their toes. And actually on my own horses, especially my mare, who is a very aggressive worker and very enthusiastic, she'll actually wear the toe clips off of her shoes before the shoes wore out, because she rises up on her toes so much to pull. So yes, you do see a difference in if they're pulling a heavy load, more wear on the toes. And a lot of that is for ground penetration so that their foot is not slipping so much, as opposed to their foot riding on the surface of the ground if they're landing flat and pushing off of a flat surface.
Mm-hmm. Does it affect the ratios you were talking about earlier, or
Not, not necessarily, except that on barefoot horses, if you are working barefoot horses consistently, there are some that will wear their toes very short. My late gelding Jack was one of them. His hind feet, his toes would get so short and his heels would get long because his heels weren't taking any wear, that I actually stopped working him barefoot. Initially, he was a real chore to shoe because he hadn't been handled well prior to me getting him. But I did whatever was necessary to get him to be comfortable with me shoeing him, especially on his back end. In fact, there was a period of time when I first started logging with him when I only put shoes on his hind feet, because of the challenge that he was to shoe. but he would wear his hind feet down to studs. And he actually did get kind of uncomfortable because his sole was so thin at the toe from rising up on his toes to pull, and his hoof wall was kind of soft and kind of a grayish, whitish color, kind of a low density hoof wall. And wasn't so much that the ratios when I would trim would be any different. I would still shoot for that target, except that once I had been working him for a while, he would really wear his toes down aggressively. And to the point that he had very little angle. His hind feet were very vertical because he wasn't wearing his heels and he was wearing his toes. And so when I would trim his feet, I would trim like a half an inch off of his heels, and I would just dust his toes with the rasp. Once I started shoeing him, then that fixed that problem because the shoe would take the wear rather than his foot. But you do see that often, especially horses that pull or work in a very exaggerated way, like my mare, very exaggerated and aggressive and up on her toes. She would tend to wear her feet if she were worked barefoot in a very exaggerated manner.
Right.
And just back to the abscess topic.
Yeah.
Working a barefoot horse like that, the white line is quite soft. And if you have a horse that, even in the garden or in the field, if they tend to load toe first and they pull sort of aggressively on their toes, and they're a very forward horse that is kind of faster paced, they would tend to get debris stuck in the white line at their toe. And that can also be a trouble spot for abscesses. So if you are working barefoot horses, it's important to check relatively frequently to see if there's any gravel or sand getting jammed into the white line at the toe. Even if it doesn't cause an abscess, any kind of debris that causes separation between the white line and the hoof wall can be an avenue for infection to get in there. And I'm sure if any of our audience has had any experience with horses, you've become familiar with white line disease. The white line disease is just a fungal bacterial infection that gets into the white line, and it's very hard to get rid of once it gets in there. And that can happen simply from gravel getting jammed in there, and then dirty debris like manure and urine-soaked bedding and things like that getting into the same canal or cavity that was started by that gravel. So those are some things to keep an eye on if you're working barefoot horses, for sure.
Yeah. And what about, and I've asked you this question before, but just for everybody else, barefoot horses on slippery terrains or ice or in the winter, do you have any specific thing to worry about?
Well, just like any other discipline or any other area of concern working horses, you really just need to pay close attention to your animal and see how comfortable they are and see if they are able to confidently carry out the work that you're asking them to do. My mare has never gone to her knees, and she is a fanatical puller. She is very enthusiastic about her work, and I have plowed snow with her. I have an asphalt driveway that's on a slope, and there have been times that we've had ice on the driveway, and then we get snow on top of it, and I have plowed that driveway with my horses barefoot, where they are literally walking on top of ice that has snow on top of it, which is extremely slippery. And of course, plowing snow is relatively low impact. It's not too unpredictable, and they can kind of plan their steps, but never had any issues with that. But then there are times logging, especially on steep terrain, where it's extremely dangerous to ask them to go on certain terrain, especially when the ground's frozen or there's any ice under there, or the snow, you're skidding down the same trail repeatedly, and the snow gets all packed down or freezes. You know, one day it's 35 degrees and it gets a little slushy, and then it drops to 10 degrees that night, and then the next morning you basically have like a toboggan run where it's all ice. Those are definitely things to be careful about. So that kind of leads into the topic of why you would shoe a horse to begin with. There are generally three different categories of reasons for shoeing a horse. There is traction, which is what we were just talking about. You can add traction to a horse's foot with a shoe that you simply cannot do barefoot or with boots. You can do things with metal that you cannot do with a boot or a barefoot. So that's the category of traction. And then there's the category of protection. Like my horse Jack that was wearing his hind toes off entirely, or a horse that might be getting chronic abscesses from working on sandy or gravelly soil, that is getting sand and gravel jammed into their white line or into their bars. Some horses that will happen chronically, and it becomes a real chore because you might be dealing with an abscess in a different foot or even multiple feet on the same horse every couple weeks. So you have the category of traction, the category of protection, and then there's the category of support, which I'll talk about a little bit more later on with some of the slides. But we were talking about conformation, and sometimes, a horse's foot is a little too toed in or a little too toed out, or maybe their hoof angle is too low or their hoof angle is too high. And there are modifications you can make by putting shoes on that horse, whether with glue or with nails, that you cannot effectively do to a barefoot horse. At least not in my experience. There are people that certainly give it a valiant effort, but those are sort of the three categories of reasons to shoe a horse: traction, protection, and support. So as far as working barefoot horses on slippery conditions, it really depends largely on the comfort of the animal and your assessment of what they're able to confidently do for you, and also how much you actually have to produce. If you're relying on the horses for your income and let's say you're logging, that's what I have the most experience with. Log markets are best in the winter. You get the best money for your logs in the wintertime. Obviously, frozen ground and snow and ice are more probable in the wintertime. So there are a lot of people who only put shoes on their horses during the winter months. And in the warmer months, they might do a little bit of logging here or there, but they primarily do farm work and wagon rides and things like that. And then in the wintertime, they really look to kind of underwrite their income with logging. And in that case, a lot of times it's advantageous to absorb the cost and the hassle of shoeing, even if it's only for 3 to 6 months in the colder months, for the sake of traction, and also protection. I mean, like I said, my horse wearing his toes off, his soles got so thin and he got quite sensitive, where even if he's not slipping, stepping on rocks and sticks and things like that, we're starting to get his attention. So the protection that a shoe has to offer was a big deal for him too.
Rich, about like the traction, and I mean it brings confidence to the horse. What you were saying earlier. I want to share a thought with you that I had today, and I want you to tell me what your opinion is about it. So I work single with a horse, and the reason why I don't shoe him is because it is a hassle, and there's no farrier around. But another reason why I find comfort in how I found comfort in that situation is that I don't have a second horse that's speeding up my horse. So my horse can slow down and take its time on icy terrains and everything. So if I was working a team, maybe that wouldn't be something that I could like do. Do you think like having a second horse does put a lot more stress on your first, or just having two horses makes it more valuable to shoe a horse for the winter, especially
It can. That's a valid point, as far as working your horse single and working within their comfort. That's definitely valid. For the longest time, my mare Hershey and her longtime partner Jack, who I know who he had to be put down from old age. They were very, very different personality types, but they really balanced each other out. And yeah, Hershey might have made Jack move a little faster than what he would have been comfortable with, but I don't think so. A lot of that depends on the horse's trust and confidence in the teamster. The one thing that, from my experience, that I have found personally is if I have a team, if I'm working a team and not just a single horse, I'm more inclined to use a cart. Now, I know some people that will use a cart with a single horse in the woods, but most often it's most typical, I'd say probably 8 out of 10 times, if a horse logger has a team, they're using them on a cart, probably. And then there's a portion of the time that they might use a team on the ground. And then there's a portion of the time that somebody might use 3 or 4 horses on a cart if they're in really big timber. But anyway, the purpose of me bringing up the cart is that adds a fair bit of that adds a dynamic to the physics of logging, that especially if you're skidding downhill, which I live in the hills in Pennsylvania, and skidding uphill is excruciating for everybody involved. So you almost always try to find a way to skid downhill if you're working in hilly terrain. And horses without traction that are logging with a cart going downhill, you encounter a lot of danger if a horse is not sure-footed, especially like in our hills around here. It's really stony, and you'll have big sheets of rock, and these rock ledges that kind of sculpt the terrain of the mountainside. And if you take a barefoot horse on that, of course, the rocks tend to hold moisture, and sometimes even springs run out of the rocks, and then it freezes in the winter, and it can be treacherous. So if you're using a team with a cart in those conditions, you really ought to have some kind of traction, because it's hard. Horses can predict what it's going to feel like if they're pulling on flat ground and their foot slips a little bit each and every step. But if they're coming down off of a mountainside, they don't know exactly where the slick spots are going to be. And it can be really hard for them to control a load, especially if the pitch is such that the log really doesn't have enough friction to hold it back. So there have been times that I've been logging downhill with my horses where they're actually holding back the cart and the log to a degree. And if you're asking a horse to do that without traction, that can be really problematic. So if you're logging with a single horse, even in those conditions, and your horse is experienced and you're an experienced teamster, there are things you can do to avoid those hazards. But if they're locked into a cart and they can't deviate from the trail because they're 5 feet wide and they have a cart attached to them, and maybe you're on the cart and the log is pushed up against the back of the cart, they're kind of stuck with the options on how to handle that. And so might not necessarily be a reason to shoe them because their teammate is making them go faster, but just because of the added physics and the challenges that are presented with using a cart and the forces that they're going to encounter. I certainly felt a whole lot better about having traction on my horse's feet in those conditions than trying to overcome all the variables that you encounter from a barefoot horse on in those conditions. Now, if you're in flat terrain, or you just simply don't take logging jobs in aggressive terrain, or you can pick and choose, like if you're kind of doing it for firewood for personal use, or you only take 1 or 2 jobs a year and you can work around the weather, you can do it without shoeing your horses. But if you're going to do it for a living day in and day out, where you need to be able to work whether or not it's above or below freezing and that sort of thing, then traction is sort of a must. Did we lose Daphne?
No, I'm still here. I'm
Oh,
just
okay.
thinking.
Oh, okay.
I'm like, hey, I'm out in the woods, but I don't have shoes on, but
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot of it depends on what type of
But
timber you're working in. If
yeah,
you're generally on flat ground, um, for us, our winters for the past 10 or 15 years have been right. Half of the time they're above freezing, half of the time they're below freezing. So that lends itself to a lot of ice.
yeah,
If we didn't have icy winters, if it was just like if we had a foot of snow, that's much better as far as a barefoot horse working. Um, they can deal with snow. The slipping is kind of more controlled. If there is any ice under the surface, it's covered up with a whole bunch of snow. But for us, like right now, we have a few inches of snow cover, but this coming week is supposed to be 35 to 40 degrees every day and below freezing at night. So it's going to get kind of slushy and wet during the day and freeze at night. And that throws a wrench in a lot of things. So if the conditions for you are like they are in Pennsylvania, traction provides a lot of consistency to your business model, whereas you might, if shoeing is not an option, or if you're not open to that option,
move to Canada.
then you might need to have something to fill some time with as far as making an income if the weather's not suitable.
So, Rich, you're saying so maybe you in Pennsylvania you might have more of an ice traction not problem, but um
A
um
consideration, yeah.
yeah. But here we have like almost 2 feet of snow everywhere. So it would be more of like a snow problem because then we have
Sure.
snow packing under the feet and
That's correct. Yeah.
would you
So
mind talking about that too?
what slide is next? What do you have on the next slide? Is it a bottom of a horse's foot with a shoe? Okay, so let's go ahead and we'll come back to this.
To this? Okay.
Go ahead and we'll see till we go ahead to another slide and we'll see the bottom of a horse's foot.
That.
Okay, go ahead one more time. Okay, so this was the bottom of one of my Belgian's feet. And this is sort of my go-to traction. This is Drill Tech, and Drill Tech is it's busted up carbide chunks in a brazing compound. My phone's telling me that it wants to die. I'm going to plug it in here quick. So I wonder if, okay, there we go. So this is sort of a lower profile traction, but it's actually quite sharp. And carbide is harder than concrete or even rock. So this is what I would tend to go with. Now, as far as the question about dealing with snow, if I were gonna shoe my horses for work, and we had, like Daphne said, she's got a couple feet of snow to deal with. There are two different types of snow pads that would go between the shoe and the foot that you'd almost have to use, because what ends up happening when you put steel on the bottom of a horse's foot, of course, the horse's foot has a lot of blood flow inside of it. And so even if the foot feels cold, it's generally well above freezing. And that heat kind of seeps into the shoe. So again, the shoe might feel cold, but when a horse is really working and has a lot of circulation, it's going to warm the foot up. And so what ends up happening is the snow tends to stick and freeze to the shoe. While the foot is creating a little bit of heat, it will create this icy bond between the shoe and the snow. And that inside rim of the shoe around the sole and the frog will tend to, the snow will stick to that, and it will stack up until we call them snowballs. A horse will get snowballs on their feet, and the shoe will actually not even be in contact with the ground. I've actually seen my own horses when we get an early snow, like a wet snow in October or November, and I have not yet put snow pads on them. They'll be standing 3 or 4 inches tall on snowballs sometimes. So they make pads that are reusable. Generally, they cost between $5 and $15 a pair, and you can usually reset them a few times. But The one type of pad is a rim pad that it basically has what looks like a straw, like a hollow tube that lines the inside of the shoe. And so when the horse takes a step, that hollow tube compresses, and then when they pick their foot up, it expands, and it'll actually push the snow out every single time they take a step, rather than letting it freeze to the shoe. That would be my preferred snow pad because it leaves the rest of the foot open and it doesn't hold debris against the frog. The other type of snow pad that a lot of people use is like a bubble pad. It covers the whole bottom of the foot, but it has a pronounced bubble in the center of the foot that sort of the same idea. It can compress when the horse loads, and then it expands when the horse picks the foot up, and that'll push the snow out of the bottom of the foot as well. If you try to shoe a horse with steel shoes and you're working in the snow and you don't use snow pads, it's going to become pretty frustrating. There have been times that I have used other methods, like you can grease the bottom of the horse's foot with either Vaseline or any kind of grease, really, bacon grease or axle grease or anything. If you do that a couple times a day, that will a lot of times reduce the ability for snow to stick to the bottom of the foot, but it doesn't really work super consistently. And it kind of stinks if you're in the middle of a 500-yard skid and you realize that your grease on your horse's feet has wore out and they're building up snowballs on their way to the landing. So I would really highly recommend snow pads.
Rich, is there winter shoes and well, like all normal shoes? Is there, because so my mentor is an old timer and he's got what he calls winter shoes. So is there such a thing, or is it just me translating this completely wrong?
No, yeah, there are. In fact, if you go back one or two slides, there was that one. So go ahead to that foot. That is, that's a light horse. That's actually a thoroughbred that I shoe. But this is a variation of traction. Then that is what we would call his winter setup. He gets the same setup every year. So at the toe, those toenails are actually called ice nails, and they have pronounced heads on the nails that are kind of sharp and stick up like cleats. And then at his heels, those are screw caulks that are called frost caulks. I actually drill holes in the shoe and then tap threads into it and put those screw caulks in. And those are interchangeable. So even some eventing horses will get the same, they'll get drilled and tapped like that. And then the equestrian who's competing can swap out various types of traction depending on what type of terrain they're showing on. But yeah, so there are a lot of people that use their horses, especially up north, like where you are, when it's a guarantee that you're going to have frozen ground and snow cover month after month in the wintertime. There are definitely going to be shoes that are preferred in the wintertime that are completely unnecessary in the summertime. If you go back ahead, you could go a couple slides ahead again. You could go ahead one more if you wanted. I don't know if there are other pictures. You could go ahead again. That's okay. So some of the pictures that I sent you were redundant. So if you go to the bottom of my Belgian's foot with the drill tech on it, there are a couple things you can do with drill tech. Is you can stack it up so that the cleats are a little bit taller and tend to they tend to penetrate a little bit more. But the other thing you can do with drill tech, like on this shoe, I just have two spots at the toe. You can actually break the drill tech, which comes in a stick form, almost like a welding rod. You could break that to be 2 or 3 inches across, and you can stack it up at the toe where you have a big toe grab made out of the drill tech. So you can set the drill tech up in different ways. But what a lot of loggers, a lot of people that I know that probably spend more time in the woods than I do with their horses, they like to use typical pulling shoes, which have big heel caulks that are turned down that are part of the shoe itself that are actually bent 90 degrees down, and they'll stick anywhere from 3/4 of an inch to over an inch down. And then they have a big toe grab that's welded on as well. I personally haven't been a big fan of that because, for one, my horses live in 24/7 turnout. My horses all get along pretty well, but you never know when a horse is going to get the urge to kick another horse that's being disrespectful or whatever. And if a horse gets kicked with pulling shoes, that can be really problematic. You can end up with lacerations and all kinds of stuff. That's just one reason. My philosophy generally is to try to amplify the athleticism of my animals through their trimming and shoeing and the way that I work them. This is just personal preference. I don't love really exaggerated toe grabs and heel cocks and all of that. I kind of like lower profile, properly fit. If you go back to the image of my horse, it's actually the same horse standing there where I made the comment about the toe clips. If you look at the way that shoe is fitted, if you guys want to zoom in on that, you can kind of see I did not modify the shape of that horse's foot to fit the shoe. I shaped the shoe to fit the foot. So his foot is 100% the shape, aside from rasping his toe to make that toe clip meet with the breakover the way that I wanted it to. Aside from that, if you look at the medial and lateral branches on that, he's got just a little bit of extra support, and the shape of that shoe follows the contour of his foot all the way around. That type of job is easier to do with flat shoes that don't have really exaggerated toe grabs and heel cocks. They tend to be harder to shape. They kind of modify the way the horse moves. I know some really great horsemen and really great loggers that use them. I'm not saying that you shouldn't use them. This is just my personal preference. If you watch this horse move in the pasture with those shoes on, his movement is going to be every bit as free and natural as it would be if he were barefoot, minus whatever the effect the weight of the shoe has on his gait. Now, there are horses that will pull considerably more if they have really aggressive traction and their feet can really sink into the ground, especially when the ground's not frozen. And that's the main reason why the people that I know that use pulling shoes on their heavy horses, that's why they do it. But for me, working in the hills, you're kind of, I've been on jobs where my horses are kind of sliding downhill, and they're sliding with their hind feet and they're paddling with their front feet to steer, and they're comfortable and they're confident, but they have enough slip that they can do that and enough grip that it's predictable. If I go and I put really aggressive toe grabs on them and really aggressive heel cocks, and they're kind of sliding their way down a trail and they hook a root or they hook a rock, they're going to go from sliding to grabbing aggressively and abruptly, and that can cause problems too. So, it's again, it goes back to like what we were talking about with working a barefoot horse in slippery conditions. It goes back to, as a teamster and as a leader of your equine partners, paying close attention to what they're comfortable with, and if they're confident, if they're stressed, if they're uncertain about their footing. And horses are versatile and they get used to all different kinds of things that we throw at them. But it does take a certain level of discernment to be able to give them the right traction, protection, and support without putting undue risk on them. And I just never really felt great about, maybe it's because I didn't give it a chance long enough, but I just never really felt great about those really aggressive pulling shoes, especially considering the lifestyle that my horses live when they're at home, how they're turned out to pasture in a herd, and working on various surfaces. A lot of times on the weekends I would do wagon rides, and that would put us on asphalt and stuff like that. And I just always felt better about having drill tech that will grip on a variety of surfaces that will allow them to be athletic, good medial lateral breakover when they're turning and backing up and things like that. So those are just decisions that the teamster has to make for themselves.
Can
Rich?
I,
Oh,
sorry,
yeah.
Daphne and Rich, I just, two things. The first is that love everything you're saying about traction. I'm a 100% sharp shot guy. I've ran barefoot for a long time, and I do run those carbide tip screw-in corks.
Yep.
Because I can, and not that because I don't use drill tech. I have drill techs on rears generally. And as far as cost analysis, I'd be interested in asking you, is it, as a guy that does it alone by myself, I do my own chewing. The box of corks is pretty expensive.
Yep.
Drill tech, a box of drill tech's pretty expensive. The time that goes into it, I haven't really worn out too many of those screw-in corks. I've lost a couple, so it's nice to have spares. But then the other thing, while I'm talking, and I'm just interrupting for this reason, actually, is Mike asked in the trim, what's the shoeing cycle and how far can resets be apart? Is it safe to say that they should be reshod midwinter, or is it more regular or less regular than that?
So some of that depends on the horse and on their diet and on their metabolism. I meant to include a photograph of the inside of a horse's foot. It was a cadaver foot, was not a living horse, but if you could see the inside of the horse's foot, it is all blood vessels that surrounds the coffin bone. And so how much circulation that horse has dictates how much growth they're going to have. So circulation does slow down in the colder months. A lot of times even metabolism slows down. That may not be an inaccurate statement, but as it relates to the foot and the foot growth, almost everything slows down. So in the wintertime, most of my horses, I would go up to 10 weeks as far as a shoeing cycle goes. My mare, there were a couple times in the winter where at 5 weeks, she was longer than my other horses were at 10 weeks. So a lot of it is, if you're doing it yourself, and if you're not scheduling a farrier on a regular rotation, a lot of it is knowing what your horse's foot should look like when they are in proper balance. One thing I didn't specifically say before, as the foot grows, it grows forward. Like even in this picture, you can see obviously the forward angle of the foot. So as that foot grows, it grows forward. That means the heels move forward and the toe moves forward. So that ratio that I was talking about, from the apex of the frog to the buttress of the heels, and then the point of the toe to the apex of the frog, that actually slowly inverts from what is ideal as the foot is growing. So if you work a horse hard that is at 8 or 9 or 10 or 12 weeks, you're putting more strain on their ligaments than when they are freshly shod. So, how long should a horse go in the wintertime? Well, if they're barefoot, they are going to sort of trim themselves to a degree. But really, a lot of that has to do with the balance of the horse's foot. And if you pick the horse's foot up and you can clearly see that the foot's growing forward, and whether they have a shoe on it or not, the heels are creeping up. They're cutting down that 60% of the weight-bearing portion of the foot that you'd like to see, and they might be getting closer to 50%. And then the toe's growing forward, and so the breakover force that is required every time they take a step, that's increasing. If you can see that they're getting close to 50-50 rather than 60-40 or so, then it's probably time to pop that shoe off and trim the foot and reset it. As far as longevity goes, in my personal experience, drill tech is probably the most cost-effective and provides the best wear. You can weld that drill tech right up on my mare. You know how I was talking about my mare wearing out toe clips? I would actually drip that drill tech over the leading portion of the toe clip and the leading portion of the shoe. because that would be the first part of the shoe to wear out. So if you flip a head Daphne to the bottom of that of this Belgian's foot that I had on one of the following slides, you can see the drill tech right there. Right now I have that pretty far forward, but if that horse were up on his toes pulling, he would be wearing out the front of that shoe. So with drill tech, you can actually wrap that drill tech around the front of the foot, especially if you're putting it on with a torch and not just in your forge. And that not only prolongs the life of the shoe, but it also enhances traction as they're rising up on their toes, especially on hard frozen ground where their foot's not sinking in at all. So that was sort of a side benefit or an unintended benefit to me using drill tech like that. I would get a really long life out of those shoes. Actually, the first thing to wear out on those shoes would be the nail holes. And that would usually be the reason for me discarding the shoes, is the nail holes were so sloppy that it was hard to keep the shoes tight, and the rest of the shoe still had life in it. And that's really because of the superior wear that drill tech provides. But yeah, those caulks are really good too. I think the caulks time, as far as talking about the time it takes to shoe a horse, I prefer those caulks. And I use them on a lot of lighter horses because the lighter horses generally only need traction for the winter time, and they provide plenty of traction and plenty of life to get through the winter. And it saves quite a bit of time. It's usually more time consuming to weld on drill tech than it is to drill some holes and tap them real quick. But a lot of that's personal preference too.
Rich, can I share? Because the only time I've shot a horse was with my mentor, and he puts old bits of bolts at the front and the back of the shoe, and I've always thought that was it works pretty well, but I don't know like about longevity and the effect it has on like the shape that it has and on the way it moves, on the way the hoof moves. What do you think?
Yeah, I was just thinking about that earlier when we were looking at that picture of the thoroughbred's foot. I have a client who it does a lot of eventing and hunter jumper type stuff, and will travel sort of in a 3 or 4 state radius to different shows. And depending on where she is eventing or showing, they would require different types of traction. And I would actually drill and tap 3/8 18 thread into her shoes, and then I would put 3/8 bolts in and grind the foot surface of the shoe flat so that the bolts weren't sticking up and disrupting the hook wall. But there were certain courses where she would just use those bolts for traction. And then if there were courses where she needed more aggressive traction, she'd keep a 9/16 wrench with her, and she'd pop those bolts out and screw in whatever caulk she wanted. But yeah, I mean, the bolts generally are.
He doesn't screw them in. He welds them like
welds on. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I haven't done that, but I have welded just scrap. My brother has a metal shop, and he had a machine that would punch holes for like railings and stuff like that. He would punch holes in bar stock, and he would end up with all these plugs, like all these square and round plugs that he had punched holes in the bar stock for spindles or, on railing jobs or whatever. And I have welded those plugs on and then put drill tech over top of them. That will give you more of an exaggerated cleat with still having the benefits of drill tech. But yeah, bolts, absolutely. Bolts are harder than mild steel, especially if you get hardened bolts or you get something like grade 8 bolts. They are very hard, and they would really take wear well. And it's a cheap, you can get a bolt for 50 cents or something, where, like John was talking about, those caulks, those carbide caulks that we were talking about, they're like 50 or 60 bucks for a box of 50 of them. So they're close to $1 a piece. And if you bought a bolt and cut it into a couple chunks, it might be a third the cost, and it's still really good hard steel. So that's definitely not a bad idea. If you have access to a welder, or you have brazing rods and you can braze them on, that's not a bad idea at all. Even just welding mild steel chunks on, like I was talking about, even without putting drill tech on top of it, is definitely going to add life to the shoe, because and traction, because that's going to be what's coming in contact with the ground. And that will be what's taking the wear. So yeah, absolutely. There's all sorts of ways to accomplish what we're talking about here while saving money and still meeting the purpose.
Right. There's another question in the chat from Mike. Did I hear mention of shoes applied with adhesive? And if so, could you talk a bit more about that versus nails, user friendliness, or someone learning needing to do all their own hoof work?
Okay, so this is not exactly what he's asking, but so we have something to look at while I'm talking. Why don't you flip back to that slide where there were a few different pictures of that therapeutic shoe? Okay, so I'll tell you what this is, just so you know what you're looking at, and then I'll answer Mike's question. So this was a really, really nice Percheron gelding that a client of mine got. And when she got him, she didn't realize that he had gotten himself wrapped up in some kind of fence or chain or cable or something on his right front foot, to the point. Now, this was my detective work that uncovered this. Nobody told me this. But when she got him, he went lame, and he started getting abscess after abscess after abscess, and he could hardly bear any weight on that right front. So I was sort of evaluating what was going on, and here he had some scarring at his hairline where something had constricted the blood flow. It had choked off the blood flow to that foot, to the extent that he actually foundered on that foot, and the foot did not have adequate blood flow to grow a healthy hoof wall. And it's not pictured here, but there was a period of time where the bottom of his foot, the hoof wall, was so distressed, and there was a negative amount of growth in comparison to his sole because of the damage that was done to those blood vessels by the injury that he sustained, that the hoof wall didn't even meet the shoe. So I had to find a way to support that foot without relying on the hoof wall contacting the shoe. So I made this heart bar shoe. Actually, prior to this, I made a backwards heart bar shoe. And I made a custom leather pad and all this. I had to do all this tedious work to support the foot so that he wasn't standing on his sole. But, and this is not necessarily user friendly. This doesn't do much to benefit people in Mike's situation. But you can see it was very difficult to nail to this horse's foot because of the lack of hoof wall. There were big chunks of hoof wall missing. So I made this shoe, and on lighter horses, there are these shoes called Sigafu shoes. They're a aluminum shoe with a polyurethane pad built into it that bonds a Kevlar cuff to the shoe itself. And then you glue that Kevlar cuff to the exterior surface of the hoof wall. That is one portion of using, or one style of using adhesive to glue a shoe onto a horse's foot, for horses that you can't nail to for one reason or another. Well, they don't make that type of shoe in draft horse sizes. And so I made this sort of like a modified cuff style shoe where I used my MIG welder and I welded some sheet metal that I cut in such a way that I could still shape it to contour to the foot. And then if you look in the bottom right of that slide, I used this product called Adhere. It's a VetTech product that is basically like an epoxy for horses' hooves. And I glued about 2/3 of that shoe on. And then you can see on the medial side of that horse's foot, I nailed it on like usual. Unfortunately, Mike, there is no economical, convenient way to glue shoes on that is simpler than nailing shoes on. If your horse has healthy hoof wall and doesn't have any exaggerated therapeutic needs like this horse, the best option is if your horse needs shoes, the best option is to nail them on. And I know that can be sort of intimidating. If you could find somebody to help you shape them, make sure the fit is proper, and line the nails up, and I mean, you could even get my contact information through DAPNet, and I could kind of walk you through it if you haven't done it before. If a shoe is fit properly, and the nail holes are lined up properly, and you understand how a horse nail works, that they have a horse nail has a front and a back, or an inside and an outside, sort of like a wood chisel, where one side is tapered so that it curls away from the sensitive part of the foot. If you understand all of that, that's the best option. Adhesive products for horses' feet are very expensive. One of the most common types of glue-on shoes that I just mentioned, those Sigafu, they're made by Sound Horse. They're like, I don't know, 100. It's in materials, it's probably $130 or $150 per pair. The shoes cost around $100. The adhesive is probably $40 or $50 per pair. And then the process is so tedious because the horse's foot has to be so clean and so dry and basically buffed. It's just really sort of a headache. So I'm not trying to discourage you with that, but it is expensive. There are some cheaper ways to go about it, but not by much. I mean, you're looking at $100 in materials, even if you're doing the work yourself. That would be for 2 shoes for a pair. Mm-hmm. So the most economical and practical method is to nail shoes on. There are some that are opposed to nailing iron onto the end of the horse's limb, and they say that that's, there is a school of thought that says that that's insensitive at best and maybe even abusive at worst, but that's not been my experience. I mean, even just this horse that we're looking at these pictures of, his quality of life exponentially increased when I was able to fasten the shoe to the end of his leg. It prolonged his life by 2 to 3 years, and he was a beloved family member for the people that owned him. He pulled carriages for them and just day in and day out really enjoyed his life. And that was all. He would have been put down if I couldn't nail a shoe on him. They literally don't even make a glue-on shoe that could have helped this horse. So, I mean, obviously we all have our biases, but I have not found that it's across the board insensitive or abusive to nail iron on a horse's foot. I've helped an awful lot of horses that stand there completely at ease like this horse. I mean, he, even with his dysfunctional, unhealthy foot, he stood there as relaxed as could be as I worked on him. It really doesn't cause pain or anything like that. So, I mean, the best option, if a horse needs traction, protection, or support, generally speaking, the best option is to nail shoes on.
And Rich, I was looking at this Percheron's foot, and I remember a story you told that has nothing to do with what you're talking about right now. But I wish you could tell the story of one horse that you hadn't had a trim in like such a long time that you found insects in the.
Oh. Yeah,
I don't know how I remember this. You told me
Yeah.
this like 3 years ago, but
Yeah,
reminded me of that.
that was a big, beautiful Percheron. He had suffered some sort of tendon or soft tissue tear in his back end, and the vet said that he needed to be. And this was not one of my regular clients. He was at a barn where I worked. but the vet said that he had to be stall bound for 12 weeks minimum and very limited activity while this soft tissue tear healed up. And so they took him to this barn where they had a stall available, but the other farrier that worked at this barn was not willing to work on draft horses. And this was like a 2,200 pound Percheron. He was a retired show horse and a really nice old fella, but not great with his feet, not ill-tempered, but just not very courteous. And I think he was probably used to being done in stocks most of his life. So he really would just lay on the farrier, and they didn't have stocks at this barn, and so on and so forth. So I was there working on some horses one day, and they said, "Oh, could you trim this Percheron while you're here?" So as a side note, that was probably the hardest I have ever worked on any horse in 10 years. He was, I was probably holding up 500 to 700 pounds on his hind feet. He was just really sprawled out and laying on me with all he had, just enjoying the experience. And so anyway, I was trimming the 1 foot. I probably took 3 or 4 or 5 inches of growth off of him because he had no abrasion on his feet while he was in the stall. They were just growing in a nice bedded stall. And of course, because he's hard to work on, nobody had picked his feet out in that amount of time. So there was old bedding and manure and stuff packed in this rotting, his old sole and his frog was rotting. And when I got in there, got trimming it, there were maggots inside of his frog. And I don't think he knew it. It wasn't like he had a disease or infection or anything, but the old material was just decomposing in his foot. And so, yeah, that was very memorable. I was there trimming his foot while gobs of maggots are falling out on the barn floor. I had never seen that before, and I haven't seen that since.
How did he recuperate from that? Have you heard some news?
Oh, he was fine. He was great. He probably felt better after that appointment than I did.
And so if you had advice for us, if we found our horse lame, and what would be, like, you've told us about the bar and like the white line and where they put pressure, but what would be your first thoughts? Well, no, because it really depends on a horse, but what would be the first, like, would you look at a feet if someone told you this horse was lame and you just had their feet in front of you, nothing else?
Sure. So there are a few real easy things to check. Like if you go back to the bottom of any foot, either that thoroughbred or my Belgian, that's fine. So if you look at the center of the frog at the heel, that's called the central sulcus. Now, this was my late Belgian Jerry, and he had fantastic frogs. Even when he had other issues, his frogs were always very healthy. But a lot of horses, that will tend to separate that crevice there, the central sulcus at the back of the frogs between the heel bulbs. And actually, that thoroughbred whose foot there's a picture of, this horse tends, and you can see it's a little more exaggerated there, he tends to have this happen to him. It's sort of like a form of thrush, but that can actually split right between the heel bulbs, where you could slip, if you had a blade of grass or a stalk of hay or straw, you could stick it right up in there for 1.5 or 2 inches deep. It goes right up between the heel bulbs. That can be extremely sensitive for horses if they get that split up between their heel bulbs. And then infection tends to get in there like thrush, and it gets mucky and it gets really sensitive. So you can imagine if you weighed 1,500 pounds and you had more or less 25% of that on each one of your feet, and one of your feet had a big sensitive split, it'd be like if you had something shoved up under your fingernail and you were trying to push with that finger. That's very sensitive. So if you notice that you have a horse that's lame, picking up the foot and making sure that the frog is relatively healthy and the back of the frog is not split or smelly, that's an easy thing to check.
And Rich,
yeah,
with a split like that, what would be because I happen to have that on my horse.
Yeah. So
But
one of the best treatments is the mastitis treatment that you can get for dairy cows.
mhm,
Around here, they call it either today or tomorrow dry cow. It comes in a handy little plastic syringe that has a really kind of a fine nozzle on it, and you can stick that up in there and give it a small squirt. You don't want to waste the whole syringe and let it all run off of the foot, but you could use a quarter or a third of it for treatment. That is a very aggressive, appropriately aggressive antibiotic, and also is effective in treating fungus and bacteria and fungi are the two primary things that affect horses' feet. So that's a very effective treatment if you can get it. If you can't get it, something like Thrushbuster, copper sulfate, you can get copper sulfate crystals, at least here in the States. I get it off of Amazon. If you go on Amazon and you search copper sulfate crystals, you can get like a 3-pound bag for $20. That'll last you for years. You can dissolve that in water and squirt that in. That is also a very aggressive antibacterial and antifungal, but it can sting. It won't sting long term, but your horse might not love it up front if they have raw tissue there. But that's still a good option as far as killing stuff. I just might not use it every single day. The other thing that I really like is oxytetracycline antibiotic. The sort of the street name for that is LA200. Recently, it's become a prescription drug that you have to get from a vet, but there are still some places that have it in stock where you can get it over the counter. That is intended for intravenous use in cattle and swine, but it's a very effective topical treatment for all kinds of hoof infections. So if you can get your hands on LA200 or oxytetracycline, that's a really good topical treatment, even for worse infections and more uncommon infections like canker and things like that. You could soak a cotton ball with that and pack the cotton ball in there and then turn your horse out. And if the cotton ball stays in there for 2 days, great. If it falls out in 6 hours, that's fine too. But any one of those, Thrushbuster, LA200, copper sulfate, or that today or tomorrow dry cow, those are all real good options. As far as other lameness issues, I would say more than 9 out of 10 times that a horse comes up abruptly lame. Like maybe you worked all day one day, you turn the horse out, you bring them in the next morning and they're on 3 legs. And there's no obvious abrasions, you know, they didn't get wrapped up in fence or kicked by another horse or whatever. It's just they come in lame. It's almost always an abscess. The most common areas, like we said, are where the bars meet the sole, or just in from the buttress of the heels. Basically, in this picture, basically right above where those heel caulks would be. That's another place. As the foot travels forward and they land, the foot is meeting the ground with forward momentum. So as the foot loads every time they take a step, if they get any kind of gravel or anything stuck in at the buttress of the heels or the bars, it's getting encouraged to go deeper and deeper every time they take a step. And that's how a lot of abscesses happen. It's just like us getting a splinter and then not. Like if you got a splinter in your foot and you waited 3 days to pull it out, you'd end up with an infection. And that's basically what an abscess is. But if I get a call that a horse is abruptly lame, I would say more than 50% of the time, the abscess is in the bars or at the heels. The rest of the time, it's somewhere in the white line, usually towards the toe. But even on a shod horse, they can get some gravel or some sand in between the shoe and the foot. And then as they walk, of course, the iron isn't going to give any. And so the only other option is that it works its way into the foot. And that's a lot of times right around the white line. The white line is pretty soft and susceptible to debris like that. So on a foot like this one that we're looking at, it's a little bit challenging because it's a dark foot. If you have a horse with a lighter colored foot, a lot of times you can see a black spot either between the bar and the sole or around the white line. You can see like this, it looks like a pinhole kind of, where something clearly entered, and that black discoloration is an indication that something disturbed the tissue there. And so I take my hook knife and I carve out that black stuff until it either cleans up and I find healthy hoof material there, or it punches through into the sensitive vascular tissue. And if that's the case, if that black spot doesn't clean up before I get through the sole, it's almost always an abscess. It almost always drains. I just drained a really juicy, nasty abscess a couple days ago on a horse, and it was just like that. It was an overgrown bar, and it was towards the end of a shoeing cycle. The bars were a little bit long and had gotten some debris in there, and I trimmed the bars out, found a dark spot, and dug, and it opened right up. Sometimes it actually is under pressure, and you can hear it squirting out like you would hear the hiss of a hole in a garden hose, kind of a thing. So when you experience that, you can understand why it would make a horse lame.
Mm-hmm. It is 8:35. Usually it's the end of our DAP chats, but we didn't ask if anyone had questions they wanted to ask Rich. So, I mean, some people asked them in the chat. John has his hand raised.
I wanted to ask Rich what your experience with using shoeing stocks is, and if you've got any tips. I just picked up a set with my new heavyweight that is kind of like your old school standard box with 4x4 foot blocks on the front and the back of all the posts for moving the foot around. And I kind of automatically am like, wow, there's a lot of improvement that could be built into this system. It works, but it's not great. And I just wanted to know what you thought, or maybe had somebody that you could send me to that might have a lot of footage that would give me an idea where to go.
I don't necessarily have anybody to refer you to. I know that I don't. So I have mixed feelings on stocks. For somebody who invests the time in training their horse properly, and I think that's typical for most people that make a living with their animals. I certainly don't have any problem with stocks. Holding up, especially if you're only shoeing your own horses and you only have to do it once every 8 weeks or 10 weeks, the physical demands are excruciating. I used to dread trimming my own horses until I became a professional farrier and I got in shape for it. So there's definitely that it provides a huge advantage for you to be able to do careful, sensitive work without the excruciating physical burden of holding up hundreds of pounds while you're trying to do sensitive, careful work. But it is necessary, and I know you know this, but I'll say it for the benefit of others, to invest time in training your horse, both to work in stocks or to stand in stocks, but also to still pick their feet up for you and stand even without stocks. Meaning don't rely on the stocks so heavily that your horse forgets how to be courteous, because there are going to be times that you spring a shoe, or there have been times when I've been in the woods and I'm working in an area with a lot of vines or multifloral rose or barberry or other invasives that are really dense. And if I didn't perfectly manicure the trail and I'm asking my horses to back up, there are times that they'll slide their foot back and to get something stuck between the shoe and the foot that is really hard to get out, especially if it didn't pull the shoe, if the clinches are all still tight. And so anyway, you might have your horse hooked to a cart, hooked to their teammate in the middle of the woods with very limited tools. And if your horse is used to just being able to throw their weight onto the stocks and not have to stand like a gentleman, it can be really frustrating and really slow your day down. So yeah, stocks certainly have a place. I never got to like them for the reasons you said. I mean, they're kind of clunky to work around. If you have a well-mannered horse that is willing to do some of the work of holding themselves up, you could definitely build a lighter weight set of stocks that are easier to get to navigate. I have been on farms where they have, like draft horse farms, where they have pipe stocks that are lighter weight and that you could actually grab a hold of and slide. One person could move by themselves. But I also know from experience that if you put a horse in there that is not well trained and they decide to start thrashing around, it's pretty daunting. So training is obviously paramount. And then also having a horse that knows how to be a gentleman without being bound by the stocks. But no, I don't really have any tips for references or how to work around them. I try to avoid working with stocks as much as possible, just because I don't like it. I don't like the positions I have to put my body in, because they're kind of clunky. But there definitely is a place for them, especially if you only have to shoe 1 or 2 horses every 8 weeks, because you're never going to get your body into shape for shoeing. Shoeing shape is a very specific type of activity, and it takes a long time. It took me 6 months of shoeing almost every day to get into shape to shoe horses without hating it or dreading it, you know. So I don't know if that helps at all.
It does.
Yeah, no, thanks, Rich. That's great. I just wonder about carrying the hoof and moving it around. I mostly, and I pick his feet up every single day. Is
Yeah.
actually a fairly well-mannered guy. His
Yeah.
fronts he likes to pull, and that's a safety hazard because I'm not in chewing safe.
Oh, sure.
And basically just
Listen,
moving into the 2,000 to 2,400 pound animal range, I wanted
Yeah.
to have stocks so that I
Yeah.
didn't have to dictate the purchase of my animal on the fact that he was already ready to pick his feet up.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, listen, I've had nails sunk into my leg by horses that pull away in bad timing. And that's, I mean, even if you avoid the infection that can come and all that stuff from having a horse nail sunk into your leg by a horse that's pulling away before you get to either wring the nail off or bend it over, that's a bugger. It hurts. And with draft horse nails, they're so long, and depending on all the variables, you could get a 2-inch piece of nail stuck into your leg muscle, and that can really set you back. So there's definitely a place. And some horses, even though they're well mannered, some horses just, after a couple minutes, they're like, hey, I'd like to have a break now. I'm going to take my foot back. And if it's a 2,000-pound animal, there's not a lot you can do, especially if you're working by yourself and they're tied to the wall, and you're, to an extent, you're at their mercy. One thing I would encourage people to do, if you can, maybe do part of it, maybe do like the trimming without the stocks, and then put the horse in the stocks to nail the shoes on, or that sort of thing. That will, that gives you the opportunity to get your muscles a little bit in shape, and also for the horse to sort of hash out your boundaries and learn to trust you, and you can kind of grow your expectations of their behavior. Like, my mare is pretty cool. If I reprimand her while she's laying on me, she knows exactly what I'm talking about, and she will support her own weight more. But then, like my geldings, Jack and Jerry, when I had them, they had both been handled rough, and I could barely reprimand them because it'd make them so nervous. So, it's a little bit of a dance with each and every animal, sort of meeting them where they're at. But yeah, there's definitely a place for stocks, and it definitely, the safety factor is definitely not to be ignored, because you can surely keep yourself from harm by properly using stocks.
Right. Well, Rich, if we don't have other questions, I think this will be our time to wrap it up.
Sure.
Did you have anything else you wanted to add before?
I don't think so. Like I told you, I'm usually capable of talking. So sorry for
It's
keeping
so
everybody late.
interesting. I knew we would get the right person to talk about this. And I mean, I feel like you've touched on a lot of things tonight, and I'm so thankful that you did. And I mean, I guess everybody is too. It's just not everybody who's on their speakerphone is open. But
Yeah.
yeah, we're so thankful for having you and for teaching us and for being there, because you're always there too at our events and ready to teach and ready to share, which is very, very what the spirit of our organization is. You embody it fully.
No, well, that's nice. That's what drew me to DAPNet. I got involved with DAPNet like 15 years ago or 14 years ago when I first got horses, and I knew nothing. And I would have been ripe for mockery if if the good people of DAPNet weren't so patient. I really knew nothing. My first DAPNet event was 2 months after I bought a 2-year-old, a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old horse. I had no idea what I was getting into, hardly even knew how to lead an animal, and DAPNet really did a lot to help me get my start. So yeah, I'm grateful to be a part of it. It's a pretty special organization as far as I'm concerned. And for anybody who would like to contact me, if you have questions or if you end up with a lame horse and you want to send me pictures of the bottom of the foot, I have helped some people locate abscesses that way. It's not always the easiest virtually, but I'm happy to be a resource in any way that I can be if anybody would like to save my contact information and follow up when you're working on your horse's feet.
That is so nice. I do that. So if we're ready, I'm just gonna log everybody off at the same time. So
Sounds good.
thank
Thank
you
you.
so much again,
You
Rich, for
bet.
everything. So have a good
Absolutely.
night.
You too. See ya.